Chapter 29. Walk 2 Moons. The tide rises. Did Peebee's mother call? Graham said. Did she come home? Did Peebee phone the police? Oh, I hope this isn't a sad story. Phoebe did go to the police. It was on the day that Mr. Birkway read us the poem about the tide and the traveler, a poem that upset both me and Phoebe, and I think it is what convinced her, finally, that she had to tell the police about her mother. Mr. Birkway read a poem by Longfellow, The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls. The way Mr. Birkway read this poem, you could hear the tide rising and falling, rising and falling. In the poem, a traveler is hurrying toward a town, and it's getting darker and darker, and the sea calls to the traveler. Then the waves with their soft white hands wash out the traveler's footprints. The next morning. The day returns, but never more, returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Mr. Birkway asked for reactions to this poem. Megan said that it sounded soft and gentle, and it almost made her go to sleep. Gentle, I said? It's terrifying. My voice was shaking. Someone is walking along the beach, and the night is getting black, and the person keeps looking behind him to see if someone is following, and a jing-bang wave comes up and pulls him into the sea. A murderer, Phoebe said. I went barreling on as if it was my poem and I was an expert. The waves, with their soft white hands, grab the traveler. They drown him. They kill him. He's gone. Ben said, maybe he didn't drown. Maybe he just died, like normal people die. Phoebe said, he drowned. I said, it isn't normal to die. It isn't normal. It's terrible. Megan said, what about heaven? What about God? Mary Lou said, God? Is he in this poem? Ben said, maybe dying could be normal and terrible. When the bell rang, I raced out of the room. Phoebe grabbed me. Come on, she said. From her locker, she took the evidence she had brought from home, and we both ran the 6 blocks to the police station. I am not exactly sure why I went along with Phoebe. Maybe it was because of that poem about the traveler, or maybe it was because I had begun to believe in the lunatic, or maybe it was because Phoebe was taking some action and I admired her for it. I wished I had taken some action when my mother left. I was not sure what I could have done, but I wished I had done something. Phoebe and I stood for 5 minutes outside the police station, trying to make our hearts slow down, and then we went inside and stood at the counter. On the other side of it, a thin man with big ears was writing in a black book. Excuse me, Phoebe said. I'll be right with you, he said. This is absolutely urgent. I need to speak to someone about a murder, Phoebe said. He looked up quickly. A murder? Yes, Phoebe said, or possibly a kidnapping, but the kidnapping might turn into a murder. Is this a joke? No, it's not a joke, Phoebe said. Just a minute. He whispered to a plump woman in a dark uniform. She wore glasses with thick lenses. Is this something you girls have read about in a book, she asked. No, it's not, I said. That was a turning point, I think, when I came to Phoebe's defense. I didn't like the way the woman was looking at us, as if we were two fools. I wanted that woman to understand why Phoebe was so upset. I wanted her to believe Phoebe. May I ask who it is who has been kidnapped or possibly murdered, the woman said. Phoebe said, my mother. Oh, your mother. Come along then. Her voice was sugary and sweet, as if she were speaking to tiny children. We followed her to a room with glass partitions. An enormous man with a huge head and neck and a massive shoulders sat behind the desk. His hair was bright red, and his face was covered in freckles. He did not smile when we entered. After the woman repeated what we had told her, he stared at us for a long time. His name was Sergeant Bickle, and Phoebe told him everything. She explained about her mother, disappearing, and the note from Mrs. Cadaver, and Mrs. Cadaver's missing husband, and the rhodanthrone, and finally about the lunatic and the mysterious messages. At this point, Sergeant Bickle said, "What sort of messages?" Phoebe was prepared. She pulled them out of her book bag and laid them on the desk in order in which they had arrived. He read each one aloud. "Don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. Everyone has his own agenda. In the course of a lifetime, what does it matter? You can't keep the birds of sadness from flying over your head, but you can keep them from nesting in your hair." Sergeant Bickle looked up at the woman seated next to us, and the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. To Phoebe he said, "How do you think these are related to your mother's disappearance?" "I don't know," she said. "That's what I want you to find out." Sergeant Bickle asked Phoebe to spell Mrs. Cadaver's name. "It means corpse," Phoebe said. "Dead body." "I know. Is there anything else?" Phoebe pulled out the envelope with the unidentifiable hair strands. "Perhaps you could have these analyzed," she suggested. Sergeant Bickle looked at the woman, and again the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. The woman removed her glasses and wiped the lenses. They were not taking us seriously, and I felt my honoring donkey self waking up. I mentioned the potential blood stains that Phoebe had marked with adhesive tape. "But my father removed the tape," Phoebe said. Sergeant Bickle said, "I wonder if you would excuse me a few minutes." He asked the woman to stay with us, and he left the room. The woman asked Phoebe about school and about her family. She had an awful lot of questions. I kept wondering where Sergeant Bickle had gone and when he was coming back. He was gone for over an hour. There were 3 framed pictures on Sergeant Bickle's desk, and I tried to lean forward to see them, but I couldn't. I was afraid the woman would think I was nosy. Sergeant Bickle finally returned. Behind him was Phoebe's father. Phoebe looked extensively relieved, but I knew it was not a coincidence that her father was there. "Miss Winterbottom," Sergeant Bickle said, "your father is going to take you and your friend home now." "But," Phoebe said, "Mr. Winterbottom will be in touch, and if you would like to speak with Mrs. Cadaver—" "Oh, no," Mr. Winterbottom said. He looked embarrassed. "Really, that won't be necessary. I do apologize." We followed Mr. Winterbottom outside in the car. He said nothing. I thought he might drop me off at my house, but he didn't. When we got to their house, the only thing he said was, "Phoebe, I'm going to go talk with Mrs. Cadaver. You and Sal wait here." Mrs. Cadaver was unable to give him any more information about Phoebe's mother's call. All Mrs. Winterbottom had said was that she would phone soon. "That's all?" Phoebe asked. "Your mother also asked Mrs. Cadaver how you and Prudence were." Mrs. Cadaver told her that you and Prudence were fine. "Well, I am not fine," Phoebe said. "And what does Mrs. Cadaver know anyway? And besides, Mrs. Cadaver is making the whole thing up. You should let the police talk to her. You should ask her about the rhododendron. You should find out who the lunatic is. Mrs. Cadaver probably hired him. You should..." "Phoebe, your imagination is running away with you." "It is not. Mom loves me, and she would not leave me without any explanation." And then her father began to cry. Okay, chapter 30, Breaking In. "God dang," Graham said. "What a lot of birds of sadness wing-dinging their way around Peebe's family." Graham said, "You liked Peebe, didn't you, Salamanca?" I did like Phoebe, in spite of all her wild tales and her cholesterol madness and her annoying comments. There was something about Phoebe that was like a magnet. I was drawn to her. I was pretty sure that underneath all that odd behavior was someone who was frightened. And in a strange way, she was like another version of me. She acted out the way I sometimes felt. I do not think Phoebe actually planned to break into Mrs. Cadaver's house, but as Phoebe was going to bed, she saw Mrs. Cadaver in her nurse's uniform get into her car and leave. Phoebe waited until her father was asleep, and then she phoned me. "You've got to come over," she said. "It's urgent." "But Phoebe, it's late. It's dark." "It's urgent, Sal." Phoebe was waiting in front of Mrs. Cadaver's house. There were no lights on at Mrs. Cadaver's. Phoebe said, "Come on," and she started up the walk. I admit that I was reluctant. "I just want to take a quick look," she said. She crept up onto the porch and stood by the door. She listened, tapped twice, and turned the doorknob. The door was unlocked. I don't think Phoebe intended to go inside, but she did, and I followed. We stood in the dark hallway in the room to the right. A shaft of light from the street lamp came in through the window. We went into the room. We both nearly leaped through the window when someone said, "Sal?" I started backing toward the door. "It's a ghost," Phoebe said. "Come here," the voice said. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could see someone huddled in a chair in the far corner. When I saw the cane, I was relieved. "Mrs. Partridge?" "Come over here," she said. "Who's that with you? Is that Phoebe?" Phoebe said, "Yes." Her voice was high and quivery. "I was just sitting here reading," Mrs. Partridge said. "Isn't it awfully dark in here?" I said, bumping a table. Mrs. Partridge laughed her wicked laugh. "It's always dark in here. I don't need lights, but you can turn some on if you want to." As I stumbled around looking for a lamp, Phoebe stood, frozen, near the doorway. "There," I said. "That's much better." Mrs. Partridge was sitting in a big, overstuffed chair. She was wearing a purple bathrobe and pink slippers with floppy bunny ears at the toes. On her lap was a book, her fingers resting on the page. "Is that Braille?" I asked, waving at Phoebe to come into the room. I was afraid she was going to run and leave me. Mrs. Partridge handed me the book, and I slid my fingers over the raised bumps. "How did you know it was us?" I asked. "I just knew," she said. "Your shoes make a particular sound, and you have that particular smell." "What's the name of this book? What's it about?" Mrs. Partridge said. "Murder at Midnight. It's a mystery." Phoebe said, "Erp," and looked around the room. Each time I went into the house, I noticed new things. It was a scary place. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with old musty books. On the floor were 3 rugs with dark, swirly patterns of wild beasts in forest. 2 chairs covered in similarly ghastly designs. A sofa was draped in bearskin. On the wall behind the couch were 2 thumpingly grim African masks. The mouths on each mask were wide open, as if in the midst of a scream. Everywhere you looked, there was something startling. A stuffed squirrel, a kite in the shape of a dragon, a wooden cow with a spear piercing its side. "Goodness," Phoebe said. "What a lot of unusual things." She knelt to examine a spot on the floor. "What's the matter?" Mrs. Partridge said. Phoebe jumped up. Nothing whatsoever." "Did I drop something on the floor?" Mrs. Partridge asked. "No, nothing whatsoever on the floor," Phoebe said. Leaning against the back of the sofa was an enormous sword. Phoebe examined the blade. "Careful you don't cut yourself," Mrs. Partridge said. Phoebe stepped back. Even I found this unsettling, that Mrs. Partridge could see what Phoebe was doing even though she couldn't actually see her. Mrs. Partridge said, "Isn't this a grandiful room? Grandiful and a little peculiar too, I suppose? Phoebe and I have to be going." We backed toward the door. "By the way," Mrs. Partridge said as we reached the doorway, "what was it you wanted?" Phoebe looked at me and I looked at Phoebe. "We were just passing by," I said, "and we thought we would see how you were doing." "That's nice," Mrs. Partridge said, patting her knees. "Oh, Phoebe, I think I met your brother." Phoebe said, "I don't have a brother." "Oh?" Mrs. Partridge tapped her head. "I guess this old noggin isn't as sharp as it used to be." As we left, she said, "Goodness, you girls stay up late." Outside, Phoebe said, "I'll make a list of items which the police will want to investigate further. The sword, the suspicious spot on the floor, and several hair strands which I picked up." "Phoebe, you know when you said that your mother would never leave without an explanation? Well, she might. A mother might do that." Phoebe said, "My mother wouldn't do that. My mother loves me. But she might love you and still not have been able to explain." I was thinking about the letter my mother left me. Maybe it would be too painful for her to explain. maybe it would seem too permanent. I don't know what in the world you are talking about. She might not come back, Phoebe. Shut up, Sal. She might not. I think you should be prepared. She is coming back. You don't know what you're talking about. You're being horrid. Phoebe ran into the house. When I got home and had crept up in my room, I remembered how Phoebe had shown me some things in her room that reminded her of her mother. A handmade birthday card, a photograph of Phoebe and her mother, and a bar of lavender soap. When Phoebe pulled a blouse out of the closet, she said she could see her mother standing at the ironing board, smoothing the blouse with her hand. The wall opposite Phoebe's bed was painted violet. She said, "My mother painted it last summer while I painted the trim at the bottom." And I knew exactly what Phoebe was doing and exactly why. I had done the same things when my mother left. My father was right. My mother did haunt our house in Bybanks and the fields and the barn. She was everywhere. You couldn't look at a single thing without being reminded of her. When we moved to Euclid, one of the first things I did was to unpack gifts my mother had given me. On the wall, I tacked the poster of the red hen which my mother had given me for my 5th birthday, and the drawing of the barn she had given me for my last birthday. On my desk were pictures of her and cards from her. On the bookshelf, the wooden animals and books were presents from her. Sometimes I would walk around the room and look at each of these things and try to remember exactly the day she had given them to me. I tried to picture what the weather was like and what the room we were in and what she was wearing and what precisely she had said. This was not a game. It was a necessary, crucial thing to do. If I did not have these things and remember these occasions, then she might disappear forever. She might never have been. In my bureau were 3 things of hers that I had taken from her closet after she left: a red fringed shawl, a blue sweater, and a yellow flowered cotton dress that was always my favorite. These things had her smell on them. Once, before she left, my mother said that if you visualize something happening, you can make it happen. For example, if you are about to run a race, you visualize yourself running the race and crossing the finish line first, and presto. When the time comes, it really happens. The only thing I did not understand was, what if everyone visualized himself winning the race? Still, when she left, this is what I did. I visualized her reaching for the phone. Then I visualized her dialing the phone. I visualized our phone number clicking through the wires. I visualized the phone ringing. It did not ring. I visualized her riding the bus back to Bybanks. I visualized her walking up the driveway. I visualized her opening the door. It did not happen. While I was thinking about all of this that night after Phoebe and I crept into Mrs. Cadaver's house, I also thought about Ben. I had the sudden urge to run over to the Finneys and ask him where his own mother was, but it was too late. The Finneys would be asleep. Instead, I lay there thinking of the poem about the traveler, and I could see the tide rising and falling, and those horrid white hands snatching the traveler. How could it be normal, that traveler dying? And how could such a thing be normal and terrible both at the same time? I stayed awake the whole night. I knew that if I closed my eyes, I could see the tide and the white hands. I thought about Mr. Winterbottom crying. That was the saddest thing. It was sadder than seeing my own father cry, because my father is the sort of person you expect might cry if he was terribly upset. But I had never, ever expected Mr. Winterbottom, stiff Mr. Winterbottom, to cry. It was the first time I realized that he actually cared about Mrs. Winterbottom. As soon as it was daylight, I phoned Phoebe. "Phoebe, we've got to find her." "That's what I've been telling you," she said.